Not with a scene, not with drama, just with tired eyes and a heart that's done fighting a one-sided battle. And then it hits. The avoidant starts to feel the void. Not immediately. No. They usually feel relief at first. Space, freedom, the illusion of control. But weeks go by, months. And suddenly, no one texts them with that same warmth. No one challenges them and loves them at the same time. No one sees their darkness and still wants to stay. And now they're scrolling through photos, rereading old texts, asking themselves why they let that person go. And here's the part they don't understand. You don't get to keep people you avoid. You don't get to have emotional safety and run from emotional depth. The real ones are rare. They don't beg to be loved. They don't chase forever. They love with everything they've got until they realize it's costing them more than it's feeding them. And when they finally leave, that's when the regret sets in. Too late. Too late to apologize in a way that fixes things. Too late to change and be the person they could have been when it mattered. Because the real ones, they may have waited longer than they should have. But when they go, they don't come back. And if you're someone who has been that real one, let me say this: don't blame yourself for giving love. Don't think you were wrong for trying, for believing, for hoping. That wasn't a weakness. That was your strength. You showed up. You stayed soft in a world that made you feel like you had to harden. And when someone chooses fear over connection, that's not your failure. That's their lesson. You were not too much. You were enough for the right person, just too real for the one who wasn't ready. And if you're the avoidant, if you're hearing this and you know you've lost someone real, ask yourself this: what matters more, being comfortable or being fulfilled? Because love, real love, doesn't wait forever. And one day you'll realize that what you pushed away was the very thing you were looking for all along. The tragedy. By then, it won't be there anymore. Avoidants mistake emotional distance for control, but it leads to deep regret. In the beginning, they feel like they're keeping themselves safe. They believe that by not getting too close, by not letting anyone fully in, they're protecting themselves from pain. They tell themselves stories like, "I don't need anyone," or "I'm better off alone," or "getting too close only ends in heartbreak." These thoughts become their shield. They become experts at pulling away the moment things start to feel real. The moment they sense emotional intimacy growing, they tighten up. They stop calling as much. They answer with one-word texts. They suddenly get too busy. Their presence starts to vanish little by little until the person who loves them feels like they're chasing a ghost. And while the avoidant believes they're keeping power by holding back, what they're really doing is building a wall between themselves and the one person who genuinely wanted to be close to them. That emotional distance might feel like control at first. It feels like they're the ones dictating the pace. They believe that as long as they don't show too much vulnerability, they can't be hurt. But what they don't see is that they're not just keeping others out. They're also locking themselves in. They are isolating themselves from the very thing they crave at the core: connection, love, and emotional safety. Control is a comfortable illusion. It's not real freedom. It's a cage made of fear, built so tightly around their heart that no one can touch it, not even themselves. And while they convince themselves that they're simply protecting their peace, they're actually sabotaging the very love they secretly long for. Meanwhile, the other person, often someone emotionally available and deeply invested, keeps trying to reach them. They try to understand. They try to reassure. They try to love in a way that feels consistent, safe, and kind. But no matter how much they show up, no matter how patient they are, there's always that wall. And over time, that wall wears them down. Because love can't be one-sided. The person on the other side begins to feel rejected, confused, and emotionally starved. They begin to wonder what they're doing wrong, why they feel so alone while being in a relationship. But the truth is, it's not about them. It's about the avoidance fear, the fear of losing control, of being known too deeply, of being vulnerable. What the avoidant doesn't realize is that every moment they choose distance over closeness, they're creating a deeper wound, not only in the other person, but in themselves. They think they'll have more time. They think they'll figure it out later. They think they can come back when they're ready. But people don't wait forever, especially not the ones who know their worth. Eventually, the one who loved deeply will get tired. They'll stop trying. They'll stop hoping. They'll walk away, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And that's when the regret hits. That's when the avoidant begins to understand the cost of their control. They start to realize that the distance they created didn't protect them. It only ensured they'd lose someone real. It didn't give them freedom. It just delayed the heartbreak until they were left alone, staring at the silence they helped create. And in that silence, they replay everything. The missed calls, the moments they chose space over closeness, The times they didn't say, "I love you," even though they felt it. The nights they stayed emotionally cold, even though they wanted to be held. They remember every small choice that built the wall brick by brick. And they see it clearly now. None of it was worth it. Because what they thought was strength, holding back, staying guarded, was actually fear in disguise. And the real strength, that was on the side of the person who loved without holding back, who tried without keeping score, who stayed soft even when the connection felt uncertain. But by the time they see it, it's too late. The connection is gone. The love has moved on. And what they're left with is the hollow feeling of control that never truly protected them from anything real. It only cost them everything they thought they didn't need until it was already gone. Real love doesn't survive in emotional silence or avoidance. It needs presence. It needs warmth. It needs the space to breathe, to grow, to feel safe. You can't nurture something real while staying distant. You can't build trust while pulling away every time it starts to feel vulnerable. Avoidance feels like a quiet killer of connection because it doesn't scream. It doesn't make a scene. It doesn't throw things around. It just slowly starves the relationship of intimacy. One day you're sharing your thoughts, laughing, being open, and the next day you feel like a stranger in the same room. That's slow withdrawal. The unanswered texts, the delayed responses, the change in tone creates an emotional tension that's hard to name but deeply felt. For someone trying to love an avoidant, this emotional gap starts to feel like walking through fog. You keep hoping you'll find clarity, that they'll finally open up, that things will return to the closeness they once were. But instead, you keep reaching, and all you get is more distance. And the silence isn't just in words, it's in body language, in the lack of affection, in the absence of effort. And slowly, that silence becomes a language of its own, one that says, "I don't feel safe with you." Even if that wasn't the intention. But love can't survive on assumption. It can't grow in an environment where emotional needs are unmet, where communication is avoided, where vulnerability feels unsafe. The avoidant thinks they're doing the right thing by not rocking the boat. They think staying quiet keeps the peace. They believe that if they just keep their distance, they won't get overwhelmed, they won't lose themselves, they won't be hurt. But what they don't see is that their silence is the storm. It chips away at connection. It confuses the person who loves them. It turns affection into anxiety. It transforms love into a guessing game. Are they okay? Did I do something wrong? Why do I feel like I'm alone when I'm with them? Love requires participation. It requires showing up, not just physically, but emotionally. It requires conversation, listening, sharing, admitting fears, being honest even when it's hard. When someone is emotionally avoidant, they shut down before those conversations can happen. They deflect instead of reflect. They change the subject when things get too deep. They smile and say everything's fine when it's clearly not. And the other person starts to feel like they're loving someone through a wall, like no matter how much they give, they can't reach the heart behind the armor. And eventually the connection fades. Not because there wasn't love, but because love wasn't allowed to live. It was never fed. It was never spoken. It was never protected. Love doesn't die from arguments. It dies from silence. It dies from pretending everything's okay while emotional needs go unspoken and unmet. It dies when vulnerability is replaced with emotional distance. The avoidant often doesn't realize this until the damage is already done. They think everything was fine because there weren't many fights, because things were calm. But calm isn't always healthy. Sometimes calm is just quiet pain. Sometimes calm is someone learning how to stop expressing their needs because they know they won't be met. When someone is truly invested in the relationship, they'll try. They'll ask questions. They'll offer love. They'll stay patient. But if nothing is ever given back, if the connection stays shallow and guarded, they will eventually shut down. They'll stop trying. Not because they stopped caring, but because they couldn't carry the relationship on their own anymore. And that's what emotional avoidance creates. A dynamic where one person is doing the emotional lifting for two. That's not love. That's exhaustion. The tragedy is that the avoidant often cared more than they showed. But because they didn't express it, because they avoided the emotional work, that care was never felt. And love that isn't felt fades. The other person can't read minds. They can't keep guessing how someone feels. They can't keep giving when there's nothing coming back. And by the time the avoidant realizes how much they truly valued that love, it's already been damaged by the very silence they thought was keeping them safe. The real ones leave quietly, not angrily, but permanently. They don't slam doors. They don't scream or demand closure. They just get tired, emotionally exhausted from trying to be seen, heard, and understood by someone who keeps pulling away. The silence they receive becomes louder than any argument ever could. It begins to echo through their thoughts, through their chest. They hold on for as long as they can, trying to justify the distance, trying to believe that the avoidant just needs more time, more space, more healing. But as the emotional gap grows, so does the realization that love alone isn't enough if it's not mutual. The real ones aren't weak. In fact, they're the strongest kind of lovers. They give second chances. They ask the difficult questions. They stay longer than they probably should. They see the potential. They believe in the connection. They hold space for the avoidant to open up, to heal, to feel safe. But they also have limits. They may be quiet about it, but they're always watching. They notice the shift in tone, the withdrawal, the pattern of emotional unavailability. And when it becomes clear that their love is being taken for granted, they start to detach. Not to punish, but to protect themselves. The detachment begins inside. They stop over-explaining. They stop reaching out first. They stop fantasizing about a future that requires only their effort. They become quieter, less emotionally expressive, not because they stopped caring, but because they've run out of ways to try. They grieve the connection long before they physically leave. They grieve the future they wanted to build, the intimacy they craved, the vulnerability they were willing to offer. And when they finally decide to walk away, it's already been over in their heart for a long time. Avoidants often misread this silence. They assume things are fine because there's no confrontation. They think the calm means the real one is content or still holding on. They mistake the quiet for forgiveness, not realizing it's resignation. But the truth is, the real ones just don't want to fight anymore. Not because they've given up on love, but because they've given up on being the only one fighting for it. They've given up on waiting for the avoidant to finally choose them with the same energy and depth they were offering all along. Leaving isn't easy for the real ones. It breaks them in a quiet, aching kind of way. They replay every moment, every unanswered question, every emotional wall they tried to climb. They wonder if they were too much, too intense, too open. But eventually, they understand they weren't too much. They were just with someone who couldn't handle real. Someone who couldn't meet them at the level they were offering. Someone who mistook love for pressure and vulnerability for danger. They don't leave to teach a lesson. They leave because their soul needs peace. Because their self-respect whispers, "This isn't love if it only hurts." They don't leave with bitterness. They don't try to make the avoidant feel guilty. They don't post dramatic goodbyes. They simply go. They stop replying. They don't reach out. They quietly remove their energy, their care, their warmth from the equation. And that absence becomes deafening. It becomes the moment the avoidant finally notices what's gone. That's when the regret begins to brew. Not because the avoidant stopped caring, but because they never truly understood what they had while they had it. They assumed the real one would always stay. They thought love meant unlimited chances. They didn't realize that someone could be both loyal and willing to walk away when they're consistently left out in the cold. The avoidant starts remembering the texts they didn't answer, the conversations they shut down, the moments they could have opened up but didn't. But by then, the real one is gone. Not because they stopped loving, but because they finally loved themselves enough to leave. And the most painful part for the avoidant is knowing that the door didn't close with anger. It closed with quiet clarity. It closed in a way that says, "I gave you everything, and you still made me feel like it wasn't safe to stay." That kind of exit doesn't come with loud goodbyes. It comes with a silence that lingers long after the real one is gone. Thought for a couple of seconds, avoidants often breathe a sigh of relief the moment they pull away. In the distance they create, they feel safe. They tell themselves they finally have control, that they've escaped the pressure of emotional demands. They celebrate the space, imagining themselves free from the weight of expectations and the vulnerability that comes with caring too much. That initial relief is seductive. It feels like peace after chaos, like calm after a storm. It feels earned. They relish the quiet mornings where they don't have to answer heartfelt questions. They enjoy the evenings without late-night confessions. They bask in the solitude of their own minds, believing they've outsmarted the unpredictability of intimacy. They pat themselves on the back for choosing comfort over chaos. They congratulate themselves on being strong enough to resist the pull of another person's emotional tides. They feel powerful in their detachment. Meanwhile, the person they left behind experiences something very different. They wake up to an empty side of the bed, an unanswered phone, an unread message. Their heart sinks into loneliness. They try to fill the silence with optimism, reminding themselves that this is just a phase. They hold on to hope that the avoidant will return, that the withdrawal is temporary, that everything will be settled once they catch their breath. They hold on to hope as though it's oxygen. But for the avoidant, that empty space isn't painful, at least not at first. They float above it with a sense of triumph. They feel unburdened by someone else's emotional needs. They assume they'll figure out how to reopen their heart on their own terms, at their own pace. They imagine they can step back into the relationship when they're truly ready, when the time feels right, when the fear has subsided. They believe they can choose love again. Days pass, weeks. In that stretch of uncommitted freedom, something begins to shift. They notice the absence of a familiar warmth. They catch themselves reaching for the phone, then remember there's no one waiting to answer. They pause in mid-conversation, realizing there's no shared laughter echoing behind their words. They walk past places where they once held hands, and the memories hover like invitations they never accepted. The relief they felt starts to lose its shine. The first crack in their armor appears when they're alone in a crowded room. They watch couples share inside jokes, and a hollow ache settles in their chest. They scroll through social media, seeing moments of genuine connection that feel impossible to recreate. They hear the refrain in their mind, "Why did I let that go?" But at that moment, the question lands as a heavy stone. It thouds against the walls they built, cracking the illusion of safety. Next, the internal dialogue shifts. They begin to feel guilt under the relief. They wonder if they were selfish. They recall the times they shut down, the times they stopped listening, the times they closed their heart. They see the impact of their absence in the messages left unanswered, the calls that went to voicemail, the one-sided conversations that ended too soon. They start to recognize the person they'd pushed away was their safe place all along. That guilt morphs into regret. They remember the late-night talks that never happened, the affectional moments they faked disinterest in, the words of reassurance they withheld. They recall how the other person showed up consistently, even when the avoidance fear told them to run. They realized that genuine love was present, waiting patiently, ready to be nurtured if only they had stayed. They see now that love doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence. And yet, by the time emptiness sinks in fully, it's often too late. The person who loved deeply has moved on or is moving on. They're healing in a space no longer tinged by anxiety. They're finding someone who matches their emotional availability, someone who doesn't disappear at the first sign of death. They're learning to trust again, to speak their needs, to show up without fear. They're building new connections on foundations avoidance wouldn't recognize. For the avoidant, that realization is bittersweet. They grasp what they lost, but they also understand it cannot simply be reclaimed. They cannot force vulnerability after long avoidance. They cannot erase the wounds their silence left behind. They cannot convince the real one to stay just because they've now admitted regret. They discover that relief without love is an empty prize, a hollow victory. In the end, the relief they once celebrated becomes a reminder of what they threw away. They see clearly that temporary freedom cost them something irreplaceable. The chance to grow with someone who saw them, loved them, and stayed when it would have been easier to leave. The reward of safety they sought in isolation is overshadowed by the ache of a heart now familiar only with absence. And in that absence, the lesson becomes painfully clear. A regret comes too late. Once the real one has already moved on, the realization doesn't hit in the heat of the moment. It comes in the stillness, long after the connection has faded. At first, the avoidant convinces themselves they made the right decision. They believe walking away or keeping their distance was necessary. They rationalize the silence. They tell themselves it was better keep things light to avoid the messiness of emotions, to escape the discomfort that comes with being seen too deeply. They don't yet feel the weight of what they let go. They move forward as if they're unaffected, as if nothing truly valuable slipped through their hands. But time has a way of revealing the truth. At some point, the memory of that person, the one who stayed, who showed up, who tried, begins to linger. It starts quietly, maybe in a song, maybe in a smell, maybe in a random photo they forgot to delete. Suddenly there's a pause in their chest, a soft ache that doesn't go away. They remember how that person used to ask about their day, how they used to laugh at their jokes, how their presence made everything feel a little less heavy. The avoidant tries to shake it off. They tell themselves it's just nostalgia, but it keeps coming back. They begin to replay conversations in their mind, moments they dismissed, vulnerabilities they ignored. Opportunities to connect that they chose to shut down. At the time, they thought pulling away was harmless. They thought they'd always have time to make things right. But now they see the emotional distance they created wasn't just space. It was a message that said, I don't value this. Even if that's not what they meant, and the real one, after enough hurt and confusion, believed it. The regret begins to grow heavier when they realize that person isn't reaching out anymore. No more late-night texts. No more checking in. No more waiting on the sidelines for the avoidant to finally be ready. The silence feels different now. It's not quiet patience anymore. It's absence. And that absence becomes loud. It echoes through their daily routine, through the moments they used to share, through the future they once thought was waiting for them, now occupied by someone else or left in the past. They start to wonder what could have been. They imagine what the relationship might have become if only they had been brave enough to stay present, to communicate, to soften. They see now that the real one wasn't asking for perfection. They were asking for honesty. They were asking for presence. They were offering something genuine and just wanted to know it was safe to keep offering it. But the avoidant didn't trust that. They feared needing someone too much. They feared being needed. So they backed away, thinking it would save them from pain. Ironically, it delivered them right into it. Not the sharp pain of heartbreak in the moment, but the slow, creeping ache of what-ifs, of missed chances, of the realization that real love came to them and they didn't recognize it in time. They now see that love doesn't always come loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's in the quiet consistency of someone who stayed, someone who forgave, someone who kept loving even when it wasn't easy, and they see how rare that is. By the time they come to this understanding, the real one has already done their healing. They've cried the tears. They've accepted the lack of closure. They've built themselves back up from the confusion of loving someone who was emotionally unavailable. And slowly they've moved on. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. They now know what they deserve. They've stopped hoping the avoidant will change. They've let go, not because the love wasn't real, but because it wasn't mutual enough to survive. The avoidant finally understands what they had, but only in the rearview mirror. They realize that love is not about feeling ready. It's about choosing someone even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's scary, even when it asks you to show up on the days you want to hide. The regret cuts deeper because it's layered with the knowledge that the door they once walked out of no longer opens. The texts they now think of sending would go unanswered. The words they now want to say would arrive too late. They begin to notice that the world feels colder without that love. The meals don't taste the same. The days don't feel as full. Even the victories feel less exciting without someone to share them with. They try to fill the gap with distractions, with flings, with noise, but nothing quite replaces they once felt just being around that person. The real one gave them something money can't buy and ego can't create. A sense of belonging. And once that's lost, it can't be recreated with someone who doesn't carry the same heart. Loving deeply is strength, not weakness. And losing that love is a powerful wake-up call. So many people confuse emotional vulnerability with being fragile, when in reality it takes an incredible amount of courage to show up fully in love. To say, here I am, flaws and all, and offer your heart to someone who may not know how to hold it. That's bravery. It's easy to be closed off, to stay guarded, to keep your walls high. What's hard is choosing to open yourself up when your past has taught you to shut down. The person who loves deeply knows the risks. They've probably been hurt before, but they choose to keep showing up because they believe in the power of connection. They believe in building something real. When that kind of love enters someone's life, especially someone who's used to avoiding emotion, it can feel overwhelming. They might not know what to do with it. They might try to downplay it, rationalize it, push it away. They mistake tenderness for pressure, consistency for intensity, honesty for demand. They interpret the other person's open heart as too much, when really it's exactly what they needed. The person loving them deeply is not trying to control them, fix them, or change them. They're simply offering love in its most pure and unfiltered form. And when that love is dismissed, taken for granted, or pushed away, it leaves a scar, not just on the person who gave it, but on the one who rejected it. At first, they don't see it. They feel relief. They feel lighter. But over time, the depth of that love starts to haunt them. It comes back in memories that feel warmer than the present. It creeps in through the silence. It reminds them of all the times someone tried to love them without conditions, and they couldn't accept it. That regret hits hard because they begin to understand what real love feels like only after it's gone. They realize that no one else loved them with that kind of presence. No one else stayed the way that person did, even when it was difficult. No one else spoke to their soul in that way. They now see that being loved deeply isn't about grand gestures or drama. It's in the little things, the consistent check-ins, the patience through misunderstandings, the willingness to see beyond the walls. It's in the fact that someone loved them not for who they pretended to be, but for who they truly were, even with all their wounds. And losing that kind of love doesn't just sting. It wakes them up. It forces them to face the ways they've been running, the ways they've chosen comfort over connection, control over closeness. It shines a light on the patterns they've repeated for years, maybe even decades, and it doesn't let them go back to sleep. Because once you've experienced real love and lost it, every superficial connection after that feels empty. Every emotionally guarded interaction feels shallow. They may try to distract themselves, but nothing truly fills that space. That wake-up call is painful, but necessary. It's the moment when the avoidant finally realizes that the fear they used to protect themselves also cost them something beautiful. They see that while they were trying not to be hurt, they ended up hurting someone who only wanted to love. They begin to understand that emotional safety doesn't come from hiding, it comes from being brave enough to be seen. They learn that love isn't about always feeling ready. It's about showing up anyway, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, despite the discomfort, and they start to see that the person who loved them deeply wasn't weak for doing so. That person wasn't naive or desperate. They were strong enough to stay soft in a world that encourages people to harden, strong enough to keep giving without guarantees. Strong enough to hold space for two hearts when only one was fully open. That kind of strength is rare. And the saddest part is, most people don't recognize it until it's gone. They begin to wish they had matched that energy. They wish they had returned that vulnerability with presence. They wish they had said the words they were afraid to say. They wish they had been as brave in love as the one who loved them. Because now, with distance and time between, they understand what they were given. They were handed a chance to experience real love, and they let it slip away out of fear. That understanding lingers. It becomes a weight they carry, a silent reminder of the cost of emotional avoidance. And deep down, they know the truth, that the greatest strength isn't in running away, but in staying when it matters most.